Hey, thanks for joining in. Today we're going to be jumping into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15 as we continue this brief video series, just looking at what Scripture says about divorce and remarriage and the conclusions that we can take away from it. So let's go ahead and jump in. But before we do, a little bit of background. So in case you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to go ahead and take a look at the video that was made for verses 10 and 11 in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It sets the stage with some important context for what Paul is writing about in that chapter. But just to give a really brief review, too, for both sides, but especially the side who does not hold a permissive view towards remarriage, it's emphasized that it's critical that what we find in verse 15 must be interpreted in light of verses 10 and 11. Those kind of set the contextual boundary markers for what type of conclusions we can pull from verse 15. But when we looked at those two verses earlier, we saw that even though on the surface it seems like it's universal that Paul is rejecting all cases of remarriage, that this is a really key verse in a lot of the arguments for people who suppose so as well. It looks like, based on what we see from the biblical pattern of reconciliation, that actually what's going on there is that Paul is addressing a specific type of divorce that wasn't conducted legitimately according to the words of Christ. So I encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that video to see why, or the way the stage is set for this verse as well too today. But we're just going to keep moving through the chapter of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're just going to follow the flow of the context and pick up with these verses today. So let's do that. So we're going to pick up in verse 12 just to get a sense of the context of what's going on in verse 15, where Paul begins by saying, "But the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy." And here's where we get to verse 15, the key one. "Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." So there's a lot going on there, including some pretty perplexing verses about sanctification and holiness and the way that's transmitted through marriage and all sorts of things. But for the sake of the conversation we're looking at, there's some really key linguistic considerations that are at the core of the debate over this passage between those who permit remarriage in the case of legitimate divorce and those who do not permit remarriage. And the key battleground within this passage is around this phrase, "not under bondage." So what does Paul mean when he is saying that the believing spouse is not under bondage in such cases? This becomes the key question. And especially for those who do not permit remarriage, they're going to say that there's an important difference in the word that Paul uses here and the word that is used elsewhere to refer to the marital bond. And what we see is that in all other places where Paul refers to the marital bond and it being broken, he refers to it being broken by death, and he uses the word deo to refer to that type of bond. And importantly, the word deo is not the word that Paul uses here, right? So those who do not permit remarriage, they say, look, there's a different word here. Paul is clearly referring to something different. We would be mistaken if we think that he's saying that the marriage bond itself is capable of being broken by an unbelieving spouse deserting the believing spouse. And they say that because the word here that Paul uses for not under bondage, or to refer to the under bondage part, is the word doulao. And maybe that sounds familiar to you because doulao or doulos is a word referring to a slave. So they would say slavery is not marriage, right? So Paul is referring to two different types of concepts here. And so when Paul is saying the believing spouse is not enslaved, he's basically, what some who hold the no remarriage view say, is that he's saying that they're basically not enslaved to just follow around this person doing whatever they want, serving that unbelieving spouse the way Christ would. But instead, if the unbelieving spouse really wants to separate, and they can honor that separation, and they're not obligated to fulfill these very important obligations and vows that Paul had to emphasize just verses early that they're committed to in virtue of being Christians. So, for instance, they're not obligated to fulfill their spouse's conjugal rights, right? Even though otherwise they would be. And so this is what the no remarriage view takes to be happening here. And those who do take a more permissive view, they're willing to concede, yeah, those are two different words. But there's two important notions there. One of them is from Dr. Wayne Grudem. He says that when we look outside of the biblical text, extra biblically, these words, or the word doulao, is used to refer to marital unions, right? So there's an overlap in semantic range that way. That other authors alive at the time, speaking the same language that Paul is using, can use the word doulao to refer to the marriage bond. So even though we haven't seen it in the New Testament, it's not an impossibility to do that. That's from Dr. Grudem. From another scholar, Dr. Kostenberger, he highlights the point that even though they are two separate words, there's significant semantic overlap, right? So he doesn't use this example, but maybe we can think of it the way we might use the words walk and stroll. Are they two distinct words? Yeah. Can they refer to two distinct things? Yeah, they can. But there's also a lot of conceptual overlap in the middle between them. And that this is, and Dr. Kostenberger, he highlights that there's something similar happening here too, that even though there's difference, there's enough semantic overlap for them to be reasonably assumed to be referring to the same thing. So we can assume then, based on the semantic overlap, that Paul is using doulao to refer to the marriage bond. In Grudem, on the other hand, he's saying that doulao refers to the marriage bond elsewhere, so it's totally reasonable to say that Paul is doing so here. So all that to say that the strength of the argument by those who hold the no remarriage view, based upon the distinctions between the two words, is not as strong as they initially think it might be once we press on it a little bit further. But there's more considerations too to take into consideration, especially from the cultural environments at the time. And so the first one is prompted by a question, right? So Paul says they are not enslaved in such cases. Well, what is the opposite of being enslaved? If you think about it for a minute, it seems like the opposite of slavery is freedom, right? So Paul is basically speaking, he's using the negative form of speaking to saying what could be said positively as the believing spouse is free or liberated. Not enslaved and free are equivalent phrases. One is just in the positive form and one is in the negative form, right? And that might seem kind of trivial at first, but it becomes really significant when we recognize that the essence of the Jewish divorce certificate, tracing all the way back as far as we can go, but especially in the time of the first century when Paul is writing, is that the divorce certificate called the get would be given to a woman. And on that certificate, it would say, you are free to any man. Or some of them that are a little bit longer say, you're free to be married to any Jewish man, right? But the essence is that you are free to any man. So when we put those two together, we see a very significant conclusion beginning to form. So the opposite of being enslaved is freedom, and Paul is saying you are free, which is the essence of the divorce certificate, which permitted remarriage, right? So it begins to seem like what Paul is saying here is saying that in such a case, the believing spouse is freed from the marriage, right? They're liberated, and they are granted permission by Paul, with the Holy Spirit speaking through him, to remarry. And they are no longer bound to the marital union. So we have further support there. But it goes on even further. We see David Instone Brewer, he highlights that throughout rabbinic scholarship and writing, there's a parallel between liberation from slavery and liberation from a corrupted marriage, right? So freedom from slavery and a divorce, there's a lot of conceptual overlap. And for David Instone Brewer, he highlights that this traces back to Exodus 21, where there's a case there where a woman who was a wife was permitted to go free. And there's some overlap in notions of slavery and the wife's previous role. But you can read more in his writing for more detail on that. But all that to say, there's a significant rabbinic parallel between liberation from slavery and through divorce. We see this even further too, just getting into the Jewish mindset, also highlighted by David and Stone Brewer, that in contemporary Judaism, there's a bit of a rabbinic snag where a woman has to get the permission of her husband. He has to verify the divorce. If he doesn't verify it, she can't get a legitimate divorce. And what they call a woman who is in such a situation where she wants the divorce but her husband won't sign it is they call her a chained woman, which is really interesting. So we get to see this connection even further, that based on Jewish mindset that we see today, based on rabbinic thought throughout the centuries, and also from what we see in the Jewish divorce certificate at the time, it seems very, very strong that for when Paul is saying in such a case, the believing spouse is not bound or is not enslaved, that the Jewish hearers or his audience in general would hear that as permission to remarry, that the marital bond is broken. A final consideration is brought forth by Dr. William F. Luck, where he mentions that the no remarriage view has to articulate that a believing spouse in this case is released from some of the marital bonds, but not all of the bonds. And he makes the point, it's more of an informal logical point, but is it really reasonable to expect that, right? Would we reasonably expect, with how little Paul has said on this, he doesn't go into great detail, that his hearers would think, oh yeah, we're freed from some of the bonds, but not all of them. Or we're freed from some of the bonds, but not the foundational bond, which is sexual fidelity and monogamy. It seems like that's pretty difficult to say, and it forces us to start drawing arbitrary distinctions that are pretty troubling. So just in case there was needed extra motivation, there might be some found there too. So all that to say, when we get to the end, we can look back at 1 Corinthians chapter 7:15 and let all this evidence, and we can read it this way. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is freed to remarry in such cases. From the evidence we've seen today, it seems like this would be what the hearers of Paul would expect, and also it seems most consistent with what we know to be going on at the time. And finally, we saw at the outset that the argument that tries to assert otherwise relies on a linguistic notion of semantic difference that just really isn't upheld by the cultural writings at the time, or what one would reasonably expect as an outsider, even today. So I welcome your thoughts. If you have any challenges to that, I'd love to interact with you, because above all, right, I'm just looking for the truth, and I'm hoping to share it with others. So God bless you in your study, and thank you.